Welcome back. We start from India, where fresh protests against a controversial new citizenship law have begun in several cities, including the capital, Delhi. Earlier, the government shut down internet services in a number of cities a day after mass protests against the law. Mobile phone services have been cut off in Lucknow and Mangalore and some parts of West Bengal. Several areas in Uttar Pradesh state are also affected. Meanwhile, following a High Court order, data services in the state of Assam have been restored. In India, a former lawmaker from the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party has been sentenced to life in jail in one of the year's most high-profile rape cases. A trial court also ordered Kuldeep Sengar to pay $35,000 as compensation. Earlier this week, a court in the capital, Delhi, found Sengar guilty. He was tried under child protection laws because the victim was 17 years old when she was assaulted in 2017. The case came to national attention last year when the woman tried to kill herself, alleging police inaction. The US says it will resume Pakistan's participation in a military training and educational program more than a year after it was suspended. The State Department said the International Military Education and Training Program provides an opportunity to increase bilateral cooperation between the two countries. Washington also credited Islamabad with helping facilitate negotiations on a US troops withdrawal from Afghanistan. The decision to resume Islamabad's participation in the program underscores warming relations between the two countries. In 2018, Islamabad's suspension from the program led to the cancellation of 66 slots set aside that year for Pakistani military officers. However, the move is subject to approval by Congress. Moving on to the US, which has announced more sanctions on Iran over its handling of human rights issues. Speaking in Washington, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the US government will freeze the assets of two Iranian judges for giving harsh sentences to human rights activists and others. He said Iranian authorities may have killed more than 1,000 anti-government protesters since mid-November. Pompeo said Tehran's human rights violations are unacceptable. He announced Washington will restrict visas for Iranian officials responsible for a crackdown on demonstrators. The US has imposed a series of sanctions on Iranian firms and officials while seeking dialogue with Tehran. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says he is hopeful Iran will play a constructive role in promoting peace in the Middle East. Meeting Iran's President Hassan Rouhani in Tokyo, Abe said Japan will do everything it can to ensure stability in the Gulf. Rouhani says Japan and other countries need to help keep the nuclear agreement in place. It is the first visit of an Iranian leader to Japan in nearly 2 decades. Iraq's top cleric Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani says only early elections can take the country out of the crisis. Addressing a Friday sermon, Sistani says a new government should be formed as soon as possible. More than 400 people have been killed in Iraq since a wave of civil unrest began in October. The protest movement is Iraq's biggest since the US-led invasion of 2003. Demonstrators are demanding an overhaul of the political system. Moving on to Lebanon, where newly named Prime Minister says he will quickly form a government to pull the country out of its economic crisis. He said political and security stability is a cornerstone for the protection of the country. Prime Minister said he will address protesters' grievances by making reforms.
I will work hard to form a government as soon as possible through consultation with previous prime ministers, whose opinions and advice I will benefit from, and with parliamentary blocs and lawmakers.
Yesterday, Diab was named premier with backing from the Iran-backed Hezbollah and its allies. Now moving on to Libya, the HAFTAR'S eastern forces claim that have launched more than 10 airstrikes against UN-backed government forces in Misrata. In a statement, it said a military camp was also hit. Earlier, Khalifa Haftar's eastern forces warned they will target any Turkish forces entering Libya. The threat came after the government of National Accord approved the implementation of a military deal with Turkey. Previously, Haftar ordered the start of the final stage of a military campaign to take over Tripoli. In Algeria, Abdelmajid Tebboune has been sworn in as the 8th president of the North African country. After the inauguration, Tebboune accepted the resignation of Prime Minister Noureddin Bedeau. He appointed Sabri Boukadom as interim Prime Minister. Tebboune instructed the rest of the cabinet to stay in office as part of a caretaker government pending the formation of a new team. Tebboune said discussions on writing a new constitution will begin in a few weeks. He also promised to meet demands for radical change and the rule of law loudly voiced in 10 months of protests. Algeria has been plagued by wide-scale public demonstrations since February 22nd. In Yemen, warring parties in Taiz Governorate have exchanged dozens of prisoners in a locally mediated swap. The deal coincided with renewed diplomatic efforts by the UN this week. The government says its 75 detainees were released, while the Houthis confirmed 60 of their people were set free. Yesterday, the warring parties also agreed to create humanitarian corridors in the key port city of Hodeidah. The two sides signed a UN-brokered agreement last year that included a ceasefire for Hodeidah and an exchange of over 15,000 prisoners. Japan has urged Russia to set free the crew members of Japanese fishing boats it has detained. Japanese Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi met in Moscow with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. In a joint press conference, Lavrov said he asked Tokyo to instruct fishing crew members not to break existing laws. The two agreed to hold a working group meeting in January 2020 on joint economic activities on a chain of disputed islands. Lavrov said Russia is ready to engage in long-term efforts, even though the work ahead will not be easy. He later called the talks constructive and substantial. Moscow controls 4 islands, which Tokyo maintains are an inherent part of Japanese territory. The territorial dispute has prevented them signing a formal end to World War II. Russia and Ukraine have reached agreement in principle on a new gas transit contract. The settlement was mediated by the European Union and Germany. The current 10-year contract between the two countries for piping Russian gas through Ukraine runs out at the end of the year. European Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic made the announcement after lengthy talks between the two countries.
After this very intensive talk, I'm very glad to say that we reached agreement in principle on all key elements, which I believe is very good and very positive news for Europe, for Russia, for Ukraine, for gas markets, and for citizens in all countries.
As the most important transit route for Russian gas, Ukraine earns billions of US dollars in fees every year. Last month, Sweden's appellate court upheld an order for Kremlin to pay over $2.5 billion to Kiev in a contract dispute. Now, moving on, the French military has deployed armed drones in Africa's Sahel region as part of its 7-year fight against extremist groups. Defense Minister Florence Parly said the drones were used to provide surveillance support but will now strike targets. She said this is a new capacity, not a change in doctrine. Parly said American-built Reaper UAVs fitted with laser-guided missiles are part of the Barkhane mission. Earlier this month, militants attacked a military camp in western Niger, which left 71 personnel dead. French soldiers from the Barkhane mission have set up a temporary operating base in the middle of enemy territory. In difficult conditions and with the permanent risk of attack, the troops live their daily lives. More about life in these camps in this report.
Soldiers from France's 4,500-strong Barkhane mission in the Sahel perform the same ritual every night in the field. They set up what they call a BOAT, using the French acronym for Temporary Advanced Forward Base. This is their camp for the night, in the heart of enemy territory.
The idea is to form a square, a bit like you see in the westerns, and we sleep inside, with people keeping watch, so that we can be protected by the vehicles.
Arranging the vehicles in formation is a precise operation. Armoured vehicles form a protective perimeter to shield from attack, and a command centre lies in the middle. Inside this setup, soldiers can remove their bulletproof vests. All that remains to be done is to unload the trucks, set up the bunks, and polish the weapons after a day in the savannah.
I think the sand is one of the worst things here. You sort of get used to it though. It gets everywhere, but we clear up. It gets in our mouths too, but you get used to it.
The camp came under attack in mid-November. The entire base switched into combat mode. Shots were exchanged until the attackers retreated. In the middle of hostile terrain that the enemy is much more familiar with, the base is a target. So despite their long days, the soldiers take turns to stand guard all night long. The soldiers pack up the camp before dawn. After just a few hours sleep, anything not taken away is burned on site. They then set off again, driving into the evening when they will set up their next temporary home.
In the UK, the Brexit negotiations have continually stalled on the question of the Irish border. Since the end of the Northern Ireland conflict in the 1990s, both sides of the divided village reintegrated. Now, Petago, a village straddling both sides of the border, is worried by the new challenges Brexit may bring. This report has the details.
Petago still has its old customs post, but it's been decades since it was used. The village is divided by the border which runs along the river, with Northern Ireland on the right and the Irish Republic on the left. Since peace talks in the 1990s, crossing has been seamless, with the line in the tarmac the only noticeable change. But things weren't always this way. Mechanic Mervyn Johnston remembers the troubles vividly. His garage is right on the border, and as a former member of the British Army, he was a target for Southern Republicans.
Now, this wasn't the original garage. The original garage is on the other side of the road, and that has been blown up completely twice. And where you're sitting now, this was the post office, and there was a bomb disposal chap killed here defusing a bomb.
Elsewhere in the village, the prospect of Brexit is having some effect. At the post office on the southern side, Northerners have been taking full advantage of their right to apply for Irish EU passports.
Well, after the vote came in, I think it was 2016, very shortly, it doubled fairly quick after that. And it's doubled every year since, and huge interest now since the beginning of this year again.
A few miles away, there's another remnant of the old hard border. The villages of Belcoo and Blacklion used to share a railway station, but the bridge connecting them was blown up in the 1970s by British Army engineers to stop it being used by smugglers. Few here expect Brexit to bring such stark division back, and the hope is that it won't reverse years of deepening integration since the Good Friday peace agreement.
We have a lot more coming up right after this short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has called on the US not to sign a trade deal with China unless Beijing agrees to release 2 detained Canadians. Trudeau said his administration has worked effortlessly in order to secure the Canadians' release. Former diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Spavor have been accused of espionage and held in China since 2018. The 2 men were picked up shortly after police in Vancouver held Huawei's chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou on a US arrest warrant. President Xi Jinping says China will not allow foreign forces to interfere with its special regions at Hong Kong and Macau. Chinese president made the remarks while addressing a ceremony marking the 20th anniversary of Macau's handover to Chinese rule. The president officiated the oath ceremony of Macau's chief executive Ho Ai-tsang. Chinese President Xi said Macau's patriotism is the important reason for the success of its one country, two systems formula of governance.
This success in Macau shows that by ensuring the implementation of one country, two systems formula stay constant, the foundation of one country, two systems can be sustained in the long run.
A strong earthquake has jolted Afghanistan and Pakistan. forcing residents into the streets in Islamabad and Kabul. According to the US Geological Survey, the 6.1 magnitude quake struck Afghanistan's Hindu Kush region at a depth of 190 kilometers. In both capital cities, residents felt 2 quakes in quick succession. However, there were no immediate reports of damage. In the Netherlands, the Supreme Court has ordered the government to slash greenhouse gases by at least 25% by 2020. In a judgment, the top court said the country's carbon emissions must be reduced in consensus with the international community. It said the Netherlands has an obligation under the European Convention on Human Rights to cut greenhouse gases. Environmental group Urgenda filed the case in April 2015 on behalf of some 900 citizens of the Netherlands. In a tweet, the Urgenda said the decision was an immense victory for the planet. In Alaska, the residents of the village Napakiak have been moving away from the shoreline for years, but now they risk losing their land altogether. An alarming UN report on climate change warns of global-scale disasters due to rising sea levels. More about the Alaskan misery in this report.
The Alaskan village of Napakiak is facing climate change head-on. The shoreline is eroding at an alarming rate. This tiny village has moved twice before, taking its dead with it.
To these residents of Napakiak that were reburied here, you may rest in God's hands, eternal peace.
Napakiak isn't alone. A government study warns that most of Alaska's 200 indigenous communities are being affected by erosion and flooding. Further south is Quinnipiac, which sits along the Bering Sea. Like Napakiak, this village has also relocated, the last time in 1979.
We're already preparing land for the new site that's going to be on further inland towards the Uralic River. Because we don't know what's going to happen. We've never seen this much erosion going. I mean, it's too fast.
Scientists say Alaska has been warming twice as fast as the global average, and this year temperatures in February and March shattered records. Hotter weather also means the permafrost is melting, with houses sinking into the ground.
When I was a little girl, snow used to be higher than me. And some of our little houses would be on the snow, and there'd be a big snow bluff. And we don't see that anymore.
In the long run, given the speed of erosion and increased flooding, the whole village could one day be underwater.
With 51 states, including the United States, still refusing to pay the bulk of their dues to the UN, the world body continues to grapple with its biggest budget deficit in a decade. This could be seen at the recent disarmament talks in Geneva, where new cost-cutting measures forced ambassadors to shout out their speeches without microphones. Details in this report.
The UN is currently struggling with a $768 million deficit in its $2.85 billion budget for 2019. So far this year, 51 states are not up to date on their payments, including 2 of the UN's biggest funders, the United States and Brazil. The organization is now in the 3rd month of tough budget cuts, which could be seen at last month's disarmament talks in Geneva.
At 6:10, the interpreters left us. And I think the sound engineer also left at 6:25 or 6:30. I think my first experience in my diplomatic career was when I saw the alarms going off at around 6:30.
Ambassadors were reduced to making their speeches under dimmed lights and without microphones. Even the lifts at the UN headquarters building weren't working. The UN Secretary General warned of this crisis back in October.
These months, we will reach the deepest deficit of the decade. We risk exhausting the closed peacekeeping cash reserves and entering November without enough cash to cover payrolls.
Diplomats and analysts say the crisis underlines the weakening international commitment to multilateralism. They point to last week's UN climate talks in Madrid, reaching only a limited deal as further evidence. This could become a serious problem in the future, as the accelerating global climate and refugee crises leave millions vulnerable.
In the U.S., the House of Representatives have approved a new North American trade deal. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was passed by 385 votes to 41, replacing the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement. The USMCA includes tougher labor and automotive content rules, but leaves over $1 trillion in annual trade flows mostly unchanged. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi gave the USMCA a green light last week after striking a deal with the Trump administration. Labor disputes in the new trade deal were one of the sticking points in negotiations.
Virtually almost every union is supporting the agreement, and there's a reason for that. This is a significant improvement over the original NAFTA. It is a significant improvement over the NAFTA that Donald Trump brought back to us. The agreement he brought back to us was totally unenforceable. It would have been a little tweaking of the old NAFTA.
European stock markets are trading higher on the back of trade deal progress between the US and China. Investors are upbeat about the recent market rallies, making substantial gains. Frankfurt's DAX is trading nearly 0.5% higher. The CAC 40 in Paris has gained a fraction. London's FTSE 100 is trading fractionally higher ahead of the UK's third quarter GDP data due to be released later in the day. In Asia, the Shanghai Composite closed nearly 0.5% lower in a slowing economy hit by US trade tariffs and shrinking demand. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 lost a fraction as Japan's auto sector stocks plunged. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.